Good afternoon. I'm Marcy Greenglass from Chilmark, just up the road, and I'm delighted to be here today to introduce our next author. Although I'm not a journalist or even a writer, you will see that Sarah Wildman and I share an important history. Discovery, identity, history, legacy. As a child of two Holocaust survivors, these constructs have permeated my life from my earliest memories right up until today. My parents, Joseph and Relly Greenglass, have two very different survivor stories. My father, as a young boy of 14, was ripped away from his family and home in Poland, spent the war years as a prisoner and slave laborer in multiple concentration camps, including Birkenau, Auschwitz, and after years in a displaced persons camp in Germany, made his way alone to the United States, settling in Detroit, where he began, somehow, to reconstruct an entire new life. My mother, as a very small child, was hidden with her mother in the basement in the home of a Catholic family in a small town in the Tatras Mountains in then Czechoslovakia. She survived the war, but lost her parents, and still as a young child made her way to America with some extended family where she later met my mother and also began to reconstruct a new family and a new life. Their stories were told again and again to us, and we internalized their memories, their loss, their love, and their remarkable resilience. Although we believed we knew their stories, we continued over the years to learn and discover astonishing new pieces of this horrific puzzle. We made family trips to their places of birth and to the terrifying wartime places of their miraculous survival. This was our attempt to recover their narratives and our history and teach their stories to the next generation. We, our family of second and now third generation Holocaust survivors, continued and struggled to develop our own identities and connections to this, our painful past. Such is the essence of Sarah Wildman's beautiful book, Paper Love. Through her own search for her family's wartime survival story, Sarah tirelessly researched her family's history and, in turn, her own identity and legacy. The painful story of her Holocaust survivor grandfather, his escape from Vienna, his reconstructed life in America, and most poignantly, the story of his lost love, Vali, creates a fascinating read, illuminating the tragedy of lost lives and lost potential lives through one person's harrowing story. In this beautiful, powerful, and personal book, Sarah sets out to find answers, rescue memory, and recover and relay a single woman's desperate attempt to escape Nazi-occupied Austria in a sea of more than 6 million tragic and desperate, untold, most lost forever stories. In doing so, Sarah has ensured that the unspeakable act of erasing those histories was not entirely successful. In Paper Love, Sarah understands our collective obligation to tell and retell these stories and has contributed to and furthered the conversation of how to talk about this catastrophic history once the eyewitnesses are gone. Sarah Wildman is an esteemed American journalist and nonfiction writer. She has reported across Europe and the Middle East for the New York Times, Slate, The Nation, The New Yorker, and other publications. A former New Republic staffer, she has received numerous journalism fellowships and awards, including the Peter R. Weitz Prize from the German Marshall Fund for excellence and originality in reporting in Europe, for the series in the online magazine Slate, where Paper Love, Searching for the Girl My Grandfather Left Behind, originated. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce author and now new friend, Sarah Wildman.
Hi, thank you so much. It's so exciting to be here. It's an incredible crowd of authors. I feel very privileged and overwhelmed by it. What I try to do a little bit is just read a tiny bit from the introduction. I've been told that Eric Larson has warned you off of readers, so I will not read very much, but I want to give you a tiny taste of who my grandfather was and how this obsession began. And then I'll unpack the journey of the book, because it's not straight memoir, and it's not straight history, and it's not straight journalism. It's a melding of different methods and methodologies, and it's a journey that's a little bit different from other books. I'm going to try not to be Marilyn Monroe up here. Um, so I will read a tiny bit. It's an edited down version of the early pages. We called my grandfather Saba, the modern, muscular Hebrew appellation, rather than the old world Yiddish Zaidi or German Opa, let alone the far too American Grandpa. Born Chaim, he went by Carl. My grandfather, in my memory and in the hagiography of my family, was a bon vivant, a multilingual, well-traveled emigre doctor who lived with the joie de vivre of a man who had never been oppressed by hardship. Or maybe that's not right. With the joie de vivre of a man who had known only hardship and then emerged from it, phoenix-like, into a problemless, promised land. He was dashing, a character out of Jewish film noir, with the perfect suit, a jaunty hat, a top note of expensive European aftershave, a bottom whiff of Odol, the German mouthwash he imported in bulk for himself each time he returned to the continent. His appeal was not simply aesthetic. His hair, as his friends teased him, was unruly, wildly curly, clipped close to his head by middle age, always pure white in my memory. Long and unkempt as a younger man, so much like my own that my sister and I would joke about our Saba hair when ours would frizz up above the hairline beyond our ponytails. His nose was a bit too big, his lips fleshy, and yet he carried himself in the way of men who know they are appealing, who understand women and men, and how to win over either sex. And swoon they did. His entire attraction was some combination of pheromones, charisma, charm, actual beauty, mystery. As much as my grandfather loved America for what it stood for its freedoms, for what it had done for him, he never seemed of this country. Certainly he stood apart from or outside the town in northwest Massachusetts where he settled and opened a medical practice. His English, though grammatically perfect, had the light lyrical accent of European sophisticates. He would biannually free himself from our idioms entirely for 6 weeks at a time and find his way back to Europe. Karl's flight from Vienna at age 26, 6 months after the Anschluss, when Hitler swept through the city to throbbing throngs of well-wishers and Jewish students were expelled from schools across the city, their families banished from work in hospitals, shops, parks, daily life, their world upended, was always described to me in similar grand terms: danger, excitement, fulfillment, nothing short of remarkable. Because he actually finished his medical degree before Jews were stripped of the right to finish school, because he got out at all. And it was complete with a happily ever after ending. The entire family, the core, the essentials, got out safely. The story of that escape and the way I understood it shaped my childhood imaginings, my nightmares, my dreams. The reality of that escape shaped his worldview. Normally I'll read on, but I'm going to pause. So sometime after I graduated from school, I was having a conversation with my grandmother, this is from college, and she told me he destroyed his correspondence. And I asked why, and she said it was from people you don't know, people from Shanghai, people who are gone, but I saved our love letters. And she left it at that. And some years passed, even though that rankled, and we fought about it, and she said, well, they're all in German. And I said, it's not a dead language. It's too late. Some years after that, she wasn't well. My grandfather had died, and we were home in their home office, and I was rooting around in his old office looking for treasures. The house was one of those amazing grandparent houses that had, an attic filled with things like flapper dresses and army issue pants and everybody's wedding dress and, all sorts of extra things. And I came across a photo album that I'd never seen before. It was underneath the windows, and my grandfather had these busts of Goethe and Schiller because he was obsessed with German culture, and Apollo, and Theodor Herzl. And beneath Herzl, I came across this album, and it was filled with these images of the 30s and 20s, images of Europe before destruction. So these incredible crowds of laughing European teens and 20-somethings who were normal, secular, happy, living their lives. Dozens and dozens were from the same woman, a girl named Vali. And folded in the back was a small note. with, in each quadrant of the note, a sort of selfie, if you will, of the 30s, a self-taken photograph, and under each a caption. Will Carl write to me today? No letter, maybe tomorrow. And I showed this little note with its selfies to my grandmother, and she said, quite bitterly, "Oh, that was his true love." And then she went to her room, and I didn't ask anything further, and I didn't ask again. But I went home and I called my grandfather's sister, who was still living at the time, and I said, "Tell me who she was." And she said her name was Valerie Sheftel, and she had come alone to study medicine at the University of Vienna with my grandfather from Czechoslovakia, and she'd fallen in love with him immediately, and he had ignored her. And then some time passed, and he realized he was in love with her too, and he raced to tell her, and they had this whirlwind romance, and she was absolutely brilliant. And she wrote me a letter at the time I was at the New Republic, and she sent it to my office. She typed it and sent it by mail. And she said, "Find out what happened to her. She was supposed to escape with him, and instead, he chose to escape with us." But at the time I thought, okay, I have these photographs. I have this note with these selfies. But what more do I have? She was just one more name, in a way. And these lists and lists of names are in themselves a form of obscurity. And so, though I got this wrinkled feeling that I had to do something, I should do something, that I should follow up on what my great aunt told me, I didn't have any way to do it. And so I started instead telling other stories. I went to Europe and I started trying to think about, what did it mean to be a Valerie Sheftel? What did it mean to be a Sarah Wildman? What did it mean to be a normal person upon whom the apocalypse of the European 20th century happens? And part of that obsession was fueled because I discovered that there had been 3 untold stories in the heart of Paris. There were 3 slave labor camps in the heart of Paris. One near Austerlitz train station, one near the Champs-Élysées, and one in the 10th arrondissement. And those were tasked with sorting and redistributing all the goods of the Jews who were deported from Paris. They would come, the French moving companies would rush the apartments of the Jews taken, bundle everything together, and rush them to these depots where Jewish slaves were tasked with this horrendous task, which was to separate everything. Chairs, armoires, cribs, plates. They were repackaged and sent into the Reich to bomb victims. And everything personal they were told to burn, to render those people erased. And I started thinking about this, that the Nazi experiment was not just about extermination, it was about erasure. And I kept thinking in the back of my mind, I wonder what I can do with this. What can I go back to the story of Valerie, but I still felt that I couldn't. And yet around this time, I learned that there were these archives called the International Tracing Service that had been long closed. And the Holocaust Museum contacted me actually after the story of these Paris camps ran, and they said, you know, you're interested in these stories, there's this archive, it hosts the material on 17 million victims. Maybe you can tell it. Even though they thought it was this black box, they thought they would tell something and it would find something, it would have some myth, it would be something, it would tell a story that we didn't know before. And still I thought, I don't know how I'll get in, but around the time that finally these archives were opening up and I applied to go with the first group of scholars, I came across a box in my parents' basement. We had broken up my grandparents' house by then, and the box was labeled Patient Correspondence A through G. And I'm not even sure why I opened it, to be honest. I mean, I didn't care that much about patient correspondence. My grandfather had had a long medical practice, but it was late at night, and I was home and idle, and I started opening it up, and it was hundreds and hundreds of letters from his entire exploded Viennese world, and they were held together with these rubber bands that no longer had any snap, that would sort of disintegrate in your hands as soon as you touched them, and they were all requests for help. From family, from friends, and dozens from Vali. And all of a sudden I thought, the story we were told as kids of this immense and perfect escape where he got out with his mother and sister and just in time and they had just done so well, it was a child's idea of success. Because who was our world as a child? It's our nuclear family. It's not the person that you sit next to in school. It's not even your first cousin. It's not necessarily your aunt and uncles. It's certainly not your girlfriend. But all of that had been erased in the kind of shiny, perfect retelling that we'd been told again and again. And in this box was an upending and a dirtying of everything I'd ever known. And there were dozens and dozens of letters from Vali. They start in 1938, and they go to 1941 when we enter the war. And I thought, wow, well, maybe now with this in hand, I can retrace her steps. I can go to these archives, and I will find in these archives everything about her, because that's what archives do, right? They're going to tell me everything about her that I don't know from the letters, and then I will tell the story, and I will have done justice to what my great aunt asked me to do. Well, I started these archives, and of course, that's not what an archive does. An archive does not hand you point A to point B in someone's life. And there's nothing that does do that, even now, even in our super ultra documented lives. But what the archive showed me was something I hadn't known to look for, which was that someone else had come looking for her in the 50s. And that she'd married someone at some point after her letters stopped, which I found romantically devastating, even though had my grandfather not married my grandmother, I wouldn't be here. Still, I wanted the romance to be the core story, and it was also wrong. But I didn't know what to do with that information. I didn't know how to use what the archive offered me. And so instead, I set about retracing her steps from where she escapes from Vienna to Czechoslovakia, which at the time originally felt so counterintuitive. Why did she do that? Why didn't she go further away? And I realized, no, it was still free. She doesn't know the Munich Agreement is about to hand over her section of Czechoslovakia. And I go there, and there is nothing left of what was an incredibly Jewish central area, this tiny part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And what I realize as I'm going through her steps, I go from Vienna to the Czech Republic, and then she ends up in Berlin, which seems also counterintuitive, except that Berlin offered anonymity. In these small towns, you were known. You were known, and the oppression was immediate and aggressive, and these towns that were absorbed by the Reich were immediately fervently anti-Semitic in such a way that it was impossible to remain there, because long before the Star, life was untenable. And I realized part of what this story needed to be was understanding that as much as I thought I knew, and people say to me, another Holocaust story, I've read a lot. I don't know if I need another one. But what I realized was even those of us who know this period really well, and a lot of us do, we still think in big moments. We still think Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, and then we think the Star goes on, and then they go to Auschwitz, or they go to a ghetto, or they're rounded up, or they're burned, or something horrible happens. But actually, in the Reich, if you were her, life disintegrated day by day, a dissension of blackness that didn't happen all at once. It happened over time. So she moves to Berlin, and she's writing him, and she's desperate, and she's so in love, and she wants him, and is it love, or is it just, it's her lifeline? It's hard to tell, but I retrace her steps. She joins something called the kindergarten seminar, which is the last place for girls to study. And for a minute, it's actually not bad, because all the Jews have been denied work now. So all of a sudden, the leading epidemiologists and immunologists and architects are teaching high school English, because that's where they can still teach. And so there's music and there's theater, and it seems like it'll be okay. She has some options. But as January 1940 comes, Jews are no longer allowed to buy clothes or shoes. And by 41, they're no longer allowed to resole their shoes. And slowly, day by day, the restrictions mount. One day after another. No meat, no legumes, no eggs, no coffee, no tea, no milk, no radios, no bicycles, no typewriters. And during that time, she writes to him again and again, and I realize that my grandfather knows more than we think people often know, because there are other people writing to him as well. In February of 1940, he gets a letter from a rabbi who says the Jews of Stettin, which was a Baltic seaport and it's now part of Poland, have been aggressively and horrifically deported in a way. They were all rounded up and shoved into a mortuary and a cemetery, and it's horrible, and people were dying, and you have to get her out, and all you need is $150 per woman, because at this point, Vali is with her mother, It's the one person she still has left. Otherwise, she is totally anonymous. She has no network. She has nothing except my grandfather on the outside. And I thought, well, why? Okay, so $150 granted. It's not our $150, but it's still not $1 million. So I wanted to know, well, what was he doing at that point? And I discovered that when he arrived, despite our tales of his instant success and how perfect his arrival was and how amazing it was to arrive with a medical degree, it turned out that the American Medical Association was actively lobbying against Jewish refugee physicians, so that by 43 there were only 2 states left that would license them. I know this because in the box of letters there were also dozens and dozens of canceled checks from a tiny organization called the National Committee for the Resettlement of Foreign Physicians, which I discovered was fighting the AMA in all these different state governments. And I will say Massachusetts was one of the 2 that remained one that would license Jews. And they resettle him in far northwest Massachusetts, which I'd always sort of wondered about. How did he end up in Pittsfield? And it was in part because rural areas needed doctors, and it was harder to say no. But he's penniless. And in their notes, I wrote to the Immigration Research Center at the University of Minnesota about their archives, and in their archives I discovered that the Hull House progressive style social workers of this group had kept notes on my grandfather as a test case because he had arrived so incredibly impoverished and so with nothing that in the same period of time that this man, this rabbi, is writing to him saying, for $150 you can save this woman's life, he's applying for loans in amounts of $22, $44, that he can no longer feed himself. They note that his mother has sold the last of her jewelry, netting her $60, that he can't pay his $5 a week rent, and that they are destitute. And there's internal conversation between him and an Uncle Avali who's begging him also to help. And when he must have tells this Uncle Avali that he has nothing, the uncle says, thank you so much for trying, but you can't do it either. And so that opportunity passes. And that summer she writes him, and I just want to read a tiny, tiny little bit of her voice, because she's constantly censored. Her letters are opened. All of them are marked opened. They are noted. So she doesn't tell him about all the restrictions she's under. Berlin, June 7th, 1940. My beloved only one, my boy, you will be with me in this world. This one sentence in your last letter stays with me all the time. Wherever I am, I can hear it, see it, and feel it always. When I'm doing what I'm doing all these days, when I'm dressing the children's wounds, at this point she's at the Jewish hospital, when they call out to me at night, when I cannot go back to sleep afterwards, and when I am sitting by the window, sick with longing, always your words, you will be with me, are comfort and torture at the same time, because of the question, when? When will I be with you? Please tell me, beloved. I do not know the answer, and the consulate has only a vague idea of 1 to 2 years, an eternity unimaginable, inconceivable, equal to 100 years to me, who must be with you within the shortest imaginable period of time, right now and immediately. Now the 3rd summer without you begins. Instead of going swimming or boating, hiking in the woods, and sharing all the beautiful things with you as it should be, I am sitting here, madly and full of sadness, and the summer is so beautiful this year. Her mother has been asked to manage an old age home where she doesn't tell him yet, but eventually she does, that has been the repository for all these old people who had known a Germany where life was normal. Their ages, when I eventually see them, because they are all deported one day in January of 43, their ages are all in the late 19th century. They had lived full lives as normal citizens, and then they were shoved into this one house together. By the summer of 41, Jews were pushed into places called Judenhäuser, where families were bunched together in groups of 10 or 12 or 15 and forced to live in apartments that had once housed 2. She doesn't tell him this, but her letters are constantly marked with other people's names. She doesn't have her own presence. She doesn't have her own identity. She is sleeping on people's floors in front of their stoves, and she's desperate to be with her mother and she eventually is able to be. That summer of 41, when they're pushed into these Judenhäuser, the State Department decides that they will not allow any more refugees in. She writes to him that summer that her visa number, her quota number has finally come due, that they have the affidavits in hand, and all he has to do now is buy her a ticket. But that summer, the Internal State Department memorandum, which was all released, the recordings of James MacDonald and others, they say the State Department has decided they will not open any new seats, and in fact, they will close seats to refugees, that everyone will have to leave with all immediate relatives because otherwise they are potential fifth columnists, and that in fact they'd like fewer ships rather than more ships. And though she has everything finally in order except her ticket, all of the other ships are sold out through February of 42. In September, she puts on the Star, and in October, they cut off legal immigration. So even if he had bought her a ticket for February of 42, at this point, it is illegal for her to do that. And still she begs him, get me out through Cuba or through Sweden. You have to do something. And there's all sorts of conversation between friends. How can we get her out? And then her letters stop. Not because she's sent away, and not because life had become so arduous, though it had. The editor of the Jewish newspaper had killed himself by now because he couldn't stand printing what he'd been printing. People were committing suicide all over the place. People working with her at the Jewish hospital are asked to resuscitate those whose suicide attempts have been botched because the Gestapo doesn't want them to die at their own hand. The deportations begin in that fall, but she doesn't say that to him. And her letters stop. But I know she's still living there, and I think I've hit a wall, and I still can't do it. I still can't tell this story. I'm still failing her. I have her letters. I haven't got enough. I can't do it. I put it aside. And a friend of mine visited me, and one of the things about the book is that I go and I meet interlocutors, other counterparts of mine, of my generation, but who are descendants of victims, not just victims, but bystanders and perpetrators. And I meet a Holocaust historian in Vienna who's my age exactly, and we become colleagues. We're at the same institute. And one night, we all go out for drinks. Our institute drank a lot. And I said, why do you do this? Why would somebody in their 30s become a Holocaust historian? And he tells me because his grandfather had been a translator for the Gestapo in Prague, and he suspects he participated in the roundups because everyone did, and it was a stain on the family that he felt he needed to address. So he is in the United States looking at the National Archives, and he looks through some of my materials, and I've gone at this point on a paper trail following. Remember, the woman had come looking for her at the International Tracing Service, and he says to me, why didn't you look for her? Maybe there's something there. And I said, well, you know, she's not in Google. She's not findable. I looked for birth records. I didn't find anything. And he said, look again. I can't believe you've done this much work and you're giving up. So I look back through the material, and at this point I have materials from all of these archives across Germany, because I've both requested material on Vali, because they kept detailed notes on all sorts of regular people. And I also request what this woman has requested. And at some point, she lists, her name was Ilse Charlotte Meyer, and she lists the ages of her own children. She doesn't give me their names, but she says they were born in 39 and 42 and 44 or 46. And I realize, even if Ilse Meyer is no longer living, the searcher, maybe her children are. And so I relax my brain away from our digital crutches, and I start thinking, how did people search after the war? The International Tracing Service was set up not as an archive, but to reunite families. And in fact, the town, which is like out of the Brothers Grimm, with this Baroque city center with a prince named Wittichen of Waldeck, whose own godfather was Heinrich Himmler, and just outside are all these SS barracks. And just beyond that is a NATO driving school, and it's filled with the requests they received. Thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of paper, all on those metal shelves we use in basements, open to the elements, and you pick them up at the time, that first summer when I was there, before they started digitizing, you'd pick them up and they'd say, Do you have any information about my husband, my mother, my sister, my aunt, my uncle, my brother, anyone from my town? Do you know anything? Is there anyone left from anyone I've ever known? Is there anything? And they had created special stamps that said unsolved or Auschwitz. And I got lost one day reading the information about a woman whose son was named Louis Clerc, not a Jew. These were not just Jews. These were 17 million people touched by the Nazis. And in those requests were this request from Ilse Charlotte Meyer. And so I did what they did after the war. And after the war, people placed classified ads. A little like what we did after 9/11, where we put up signs across New York City asking for information about people. And they would put classified ads in refugee newsletters, which were at the time not old. In the U.S., we had the Aufbau, which was called Reconstruction. And in my grandparents' house, the Aufbau was on the coffee table alongside the New England Journal of Medicine. It was always subscribed to. The West German government broke the news they'd be paying indemnity payments to Jews to the Aufbau, not the New York Times. It had a circulation of almost 500,000. There was a smaller journal in the UK called the Association for Jewish Refugees, Jewish Refugees, and I placed the ad there. I asked everything I knew. And I went away to a conference and I forgot about it. It was some months later, I went to a conference in London and I forgot about this ad. And I begged this conference to let me stay an extra night because otherwise, you could be in Cincinnati. It doesn't really matter. And I stayed one extra day. And in between going to the Tate and going out to dinner, I checked my email. And there I found an email from a woman saying, imagine my emotion. I'm the youngest. I'm the youngest daughter of the searcher. I think I might have something you're looking for. I don't know if you're ever in London. I'll stop there. I'm sorry, I totally went over. So we have a couple minutes for questions, apparently. Questions? No questions?
Can you ask a question at the mic?
That was amazing, thank you. The question I have it really does not pertain directly to the book, but when you were doing this, you're obviously spending so much time in Europe. With all that's happening in Europe now with anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism, how do you view that in terms of your search for what happened to these people?
I mean, it's a huge question. I think that we have to be careful about assigning similarities. I think that the language of the 30s has been co-opted into a debate about the modern Middle East conflict. I think that we need to be cautious and careful about what's happening, but remember that it's not top-down anti-Semitic legislation, that the leaders of Europe are saying all the right things and are aware of the problem, and that it is instead actually more diffuse and a little bit more complicated to address, but it's not about, let's say, Germany imposing, restriction after restriction after restriction. And I think we have to be careful about looking for new tools to address modern anti-Semitism and not only use the tools of the past, because the issue is not quite the same. It's a short way of answering that. Any other questions?
Did you say earlier that the Gestapo resuscitated Jews who tried to commit? It never repeated the question.
She asked if the Gestapo resuscitated Jews who tried to kill themselves. Yes, they would resuscitate them, get them back to health, and then deport them. I would like to not end on that note.
Tell the rest of the story.
What?
Tell a little more of the story.
Oh, of Bali? Wait, does anyone have any other questions or no? Yeah.
I'm just wondering if your father, your grandfather and my father perhaps may have known each other because the stories were so similar out of Europe and making it to the United States from after medical school when they could no longer, when my father could no longer finish medical school, but that was the end of being able to do anything. And so he was able to get out and settled in a very small town. And what was interesting is that the medical establishment. What was interesting is that the medical establishment would send physicians who had finished their training in in Europe, but didn't necessarily want them to settle and practice in the established areas of the country where medicine was at the forefront, but in very, very small towns where there was a great need. And so they fulfilled an important role in serving Americans who were in need of medical care.
Yeah, thank you. Any other quick questions or no? I know we can. I can wrap up. Okay.